I'll be honest, I love movies about the outer space. I have probably seen Interstellar more times than an undergraduate architecture student should be allowed to. But I never really thought about it as an architect. I never thought of the extraterrestrial space as real estate, or that the extraterrestrial real estate could be privatized. I never thought about the life of satellites or how they die. And I definitely never thought about what happens to their debris after they are decommissioned. Not until I saw Rajji's master's thesis presentation at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. I was truly blown away when I heard her talk about space waste and how these objects are retired to what I call the graveyard orbits and the spacecraft cemeteries. So today, we are in conversation with urban climate researcher and designer Rajji Desai about the afterlives of orbital infrastructures and how these objects in the outer space have an influence on everything that spans from the Earth's high orbits to its high seas. My name is Vaissnavi Shukl and this is Architecture of Center, a podcast where we highlight unconventional design practices and research projects that reflect the emerging discourses within the design discipline and beyond. Architecture of Center features conversations with some exceptionally creative individuals who have extrapolated the traditional fields of architecture, planning, landscape, and urban design. Hi, Rajji. It's so exciting to have you here today on Architecture of Center. We're here today to talk about your thesis, which has been a fascinating project. So tell us a little bit about your thesis, and I think more importantly, how did you end up in the outer space?
Thank you so much, Vaishnavi, for having me on this amazing venture of yours. I am really, really thankful to you for that you considered me worthy to speak something that I keep doing all the time. This was fairly recent in kind of like my academic trajectory. I had graduated from undergrad where I had done a similar kind of investigation for my undergraduate thesis, which looked at the shipbreaking industry in India, in Alang, which you know is one of the world's largest. It's actually the world's largest shipbreaking industry. And so I was always fascinated with the intersection of like environmental histories, externalities, and waste, and especially to do with like large scale infrastructures that facilitate our day to day lives. So it was always a topic of fascination for me, like, ships being these kind of colossal, almost like these cathedrals floating in the water, and then how they come to be deconstructed and kind of recirculated within our systems of like everyday production, extraction, circulation, etc., was always very fascinating for me. So it kind of was like, imbibed in my internal memory in some way, like subconsciously, these were the threads which were always playing at the back of my mind. And because it was fairly recent since, from undergrad to graduate school, it was not, I didn't have that much of time to kind of fully bake these ideas in my mind. So when I came to graduate school, this was something that was still subconsciously in my mind. As far as my thesis is concerned, like I took the concept of externalization one step further, where I was really like fortunate to work with Neil Brenner, who was at the GSD at the time, who was like a professor of urban theory. And I was really fascinated with what happens, with like especially structures such as satellites and orbital kind of, infrastructures like space stations, etc., which similar to ships in a lot of ways are so like, we're almost oblivious to them. These are large kind of structures which are, so fundamental to facilitating our lives. Like satellites are so instrumental in our day-to-day workings, like whether it's GPS, whether it's monitoring our weather, or whether it's like simply like communicating across different kind of, places. So I was very fascinated with what happens, like, with these. And like in a lot of ways, like, these are also kind of objects which are like, which we all know of their existence, but they're still so peripheral in our understanding of our world.
I think this for me is super fascinating. And I think it's also super interesting how you refer to these as the orbital infrastructure, infrastructure, quote unquote. So let's try on that a little bit and you can get into more detail. I'm intrigued by your particular choice of the word infrastructure. When you think about infrastructure on Earth, you think about state-sponsored transportation projects, right? You're thinking about highways, you're thinking about large metro projects, you're thinking about infrastructure as in a physical thing that you almost see building on a day-to-day basis that takes years. What makes you think about these objects in space as infrastructure, and why do you call them infrastructures as opposed to, I don't know, services or frameworks or something?
Yeah, it's interesting that you asked me this. For me, infrastructure in a lot of ways has always transcended their physical being and to like something which is like a form or a mode of institutionalizing certain codes of conduct, certain behaviors. Infrastructures for me have transcended them being like say metro rails, or they've transcended them being roads, etc. They also become certain kind of ways of coding human behavior, and hence like because of the profound implications that orbital infrastructure such as satellites have on our lives, whether it's like their importance in like nationwide kind of political domains where it's used as a means of warfare, or whether it's a means of facilitating communication, or whether it's means of like predicting future climate data trends, etc. So they become very important in a lot of ways, like infrastructures as a means or institutionalizing human behaviors for me has always been that. Also for me, infrastructures form a very important kind of lens, or a, like a specific point in like time and space, which is about to do with a different kind of coming together of historical, economic, environmental, socio-political kind of situatedness of different actors together. An infrastructure project is not simply like a one agent thing. It's something which has like, it cuts across scale, it cuts across geographies, it cuts across race, it cuts across a lot of different things because of the massive and the sheer scale of it and the implications that it has in a lot of ways. So for me, it almost came naturally to like, it was almost in my mental vocabulary to use infrastructure when it came to orbital objects such as satellites, or orbital systems such as satellite systems. So that's been my kind of understanding of infrastructures per se.
So you mentioned something about these infrastructure as things that cut across socio-political boundaries and race boundaries, basically literally transcending everything that limits us on Earth as well as in space. Can you talk a little bit more about what these things actually are? What do you find in this space, and what are these things? They're GPS satellites. What else? Because I am by default reminded of the space race of the 60s and the 70s when there was this almost pretty similar to what's going on right now. There's a race for vaccine, and the other day I was telling a friend, you first saw Pfizer saying we have a 90 point something accuracy, and then you have another company saying, oh no, but we're 95, and then you kind of one up each other. And that was pretty similar to what the space race in the 60s and 70s was, where everybody's like, you're going to one up the other person to kind of get to the space super fast, and kind of lay your claim on that domain or that space, like quite literally the outer space. So what is it that happens in the outer space, and what does that realm look like?
Like, let's take a case in point of the internet infrastructure. Now the internet is something we are most familiar with, all of us almost in developed countries and developing countries are using it. So from a mere like 16 or 15% of the world population in 2005 that had internet users, it jumped to 47% in 2016. And by 2017, approximately half of the world's population had access to internet. So now at present, there are about 2.5 billion users from Europe and United States itself, while the remaining 80 million are still largely living in urban centers across the developing countries who have access. So what essentially happened in this jump, or the gap which happened, is this kind of operationalization, as Neil Brenner says it, of outer space. So essentially in this provision of internet infrastructure, we started using we made a switch from using like say underground data cables to provide internet services to using satellites in outer space, because it's something that all of us, it's almost indispensable to us, and it's been largely facilitated through satellites. So satellites is one of the first ways in which it has so much profound implications on our day-to-day living, and similar to getting like say coal for fossil fuels which gets transported through ships, etc. So it's something like that which is so important, because these satellite infrastructures you need in your day-to-day life, like whether it's like GPS, or whether it's like weather monitoring, or like a bunch of all these kind of different remote sensing systems. You have a lot of kind of uses of these kind of objects in outer space. These infrastructural objects in outer space are so integral to our day-to-day living.
And who owns these objects? So are they kind of state owned? Are they multinational corporation owned?
No, it's great that you asked this because Vaish, over the course of the latter half of the 20th century, humankind started expanding its boundaries, and borders beyond the confines of the planet itself. So, what we initially were thinking about outer space is mainly for, like, gaining strategic advantage, for nationalistic endeavors, or the pursuit of scientific knowledge. So, in that time, this entire kind of realm of outer space became a de facto monopoly almost of sorts of repeatedly, as we saw with Russia, we saw it with, sorry, the Soviet Union, the then Soviet Union, with the United States, with France, etc., with all these countries kind of using outer space as an operational scape within the international political sphere. While such ways of looking at orbital space still continue in our day-to-day life, where people don't still associate this switch which has happened, or this transition that has happened from the kind of propaganda of outer space to this kind of private militaristic, private kind of capitalist switch, we're seeing new kind of actors emerging. In fact, the developments over the past few decades have shown like a crazy jump in this ambitious orbital space experimentation. And what has been interesting is that these private kind of beneficiaries are interacting with political frameworks. So what is happening is that we're seeing collaborations between nation states, and then we're seeing kind of like these singular entrepreneurial actors such as Elon Musk, Jim Benson, you can name Paul Allen, you can, like, we have like Jeff Bezos. These are just few kind of Richard Branson. These are the few kind of like very strategic actors who are private companies, and they're entrepreneurial kind of astro entrepreneurs. Well, that's what many people call them, who are now, with the aid of, like, nation states, are building and capitalizing on this kind of a new frontier almost of sorts, which is outer space. So while this has been, like, a way to, like, operationalize outer space to so-called, public benefits, like I mentioned with internet infrastructure, where Elon Musk is saying he's actually started putting, like, internet satellites in the different orbits of the earth to provide internet for every human being on earth, while they are often taken on with this kind of, almost an altruistic notion, they are also very, very powerful means of expanding access and control over untapped territories in orbital space. And eventually their natural resources, like we've been hearing about space tourism coming up. So it's almost like trying to get this kind of, a leg up, or a political and an economic advantage at an interplanetary scale. So we're no longer looking at our planet itself, we're looking at another scale or another realm or a jump up into the outer, like, kind of the outer envelope of the earth, which is only set to increase in the coming decade, according to me. So, like, that's what the thing is, in spite of this having had its roots in the space race that started in the early 20th century, now we are seeing that these nationalistic motives have almost started eroding, with kind of like private agencies such as Musk, etc., like, collaborating with different nation states. So it's no longer restricted to the United States, but now we're seeing all different actors which are crossing across all these political kind of, nationalistic boundaries into a more privatized realm in a lot of ways.
It's super interesting that you're kind of mentioning the privatization of the outer space, and I found it super fascinating because this seems like a booming market for real estate, except it's in the outer space. It kind of exists, but it perhaps not real, or rather it's not tangible or visible to those bidding for it. With the kind of stuff that we've seen in real estate markets around the world, be it in India or be it in the US, literally anywhere, where do you see this outer space real estate market going from here? You mentioned the involvement of a lot of these private actors, be it Tesla or be it Jeff Bezos, kind of showing an active interest in looking at the outer space as a space to invest in, to kind of monopolize on, or to kind of use it as an excuse for, if nothing, just increasing access on earth, right? So what does the future look like, both in terms of it as a booming market, but also kind of the grim side of it, and what that potential could look like were to go down that road?
So, like, in terms of, like, where do I see this going, this is definitely a booming market, like, it's because what is happening is that, quite contradictory to what we might think, that outer space is infinite, it's actually not, because there are only certain orbits which are beyond the earth's atmosphere that are kind of, useful for us to operationalize or use or capitalize on, because of this simple nature that when you launch, like out of these orbits, the geosynchronous orbit is the most profitable real estate in outer space. So, and right now what is happening with this kind of, the geosynchronous orbit is that, okay, just a brief history of the geosynchronous orbit is that with the geosynchronous orbit, you only need 3 satellites at any given point to map the entire surface of the Earth. So, unlike any other altitudes above the surface of the Earth, where you would need multiple satellites to be launched in order to kind of, carry out your operations, with geosynchronous orbit, you only need 3. So, first, it's very economical in a lot of ways, and hence almost all different kind of private as well as nation states have been trying to capitalize on this kind of very prime location kind of in a lot of ways in outer space. What this has resulted is that it's become extremely overpopulated, in a lot of ways. So there is a very high density of satellites, and as you can imagine, these are very fast moving objects which are like constantly in motion in different orbits. There is a very high risk of collision. So right now, because we don't have any kind of stringent internationally binding rules or laws or treaties, what often has resulted is whoever is the first to claim a space in the geosynchronous orbit almost gets de facto authority or ownership of that space. So right now there's a lot of stiff competition that has occurred in trying to capitalize this GEO, which is a geosynchronous orbit. And that's why most of these space capitalists, if you think about it, are always vying for this altitudinal position in a lot of ways. So largely, and which is one thing which is so interesting, is because this real estate is so like integral to their operations on Earth, we are seeing a lot of terrestrial reshuffling on Earth. So if you were to see, like in order for you to launch something into the geosynchronous orbit, the best position for you to be located on Earth would be around the equator. So what you're seeing is the emergence of new spaceports around the equator, so that you can easily launch your satellite into orbital space with the least amount of fuel, and hence it's the cheapest way of doing that. So not only has this real estate had profound implications on what it's doing in terms of reshuffling geographically in outer space, but it's also having very, very significant kind of terrestrial reshuffling which is happening on Earth. So it's almost like a couple, it's a coupling of these kind of movements, like in outer space, it almost reflects a change on Earth as well. So this has been a very kind of like distinctive trait which we've been seeing in this ongoing race towards privatization, that you're also seeing the emergence of like these kind of geographical zones which are strategically positioned near the equator, which would facilitate the easy launch of these satellites into space. The other thing is that you in addition to like these kind of new geographical, this is what I call in my thesis, like there is a specific targeted geographical privileging on Earth which is happening, and deprivileging. So we are kind of considering certain zones to be okay enough to be sacrificed in a lot of ways, take borrowing from Naomi Klein's like sacrifice zones. So this has been a kind of an interesting way of looking at this new trend of orbital urbanization in a lot of ways.
For what it's worth, the same orbital forces that are making the production of this podcast possible are the ones making their presence felt through glitches and static in certain sections of today's interview. So while we refill our tea and coffee, here's a preview of the next episode with Karan Saharia, where we look at the evolution of Indian cities and their relationship with religion and politics.
But this is also reflective of the larger societal change which is happening. Like the idea of creating this political identity in the name of religion to create a kind of majoritarianism that is, in trying to be aggressive in its aspiration materially, is almost creating this exclusionary agenda at the same time.
Tune back in 2 weeks to know more about what Karan is talking about. Back to Rajji now.
This blows my mind on so many different levels, because one, I think you're talking about a certain kind of land grab, so to speak, in the outer space where there is no land to grab, but there's space to grab. And you're kind of saying that whoever gets there first kind of plays a de facto claim on them occupying a certain territory. And I think the other thing you mentioned, more importantly, is the fact that this, because it's outside of the bounds of Earth, doesn't mean is infinite space, right? I mean, this space is also limited, and it has repercussions on what happens on Earth. So currently, I think what you mentioned is its place of takeoff, and its privileging of place around the equator. And so I think while we're talking about the outer space, you also focus on these spaces around the equator, and you also talk a little bit about the role of oceans and what you call the aphotic zone, if I pronounced it right, where this space debris ends up, if it is ever brought back to Earth in case of the collision that you mentioned. All these spaces, kind of satellites being crowded in the outer space, and then they hit each other, and then it's like, woof, all those space movies come to life. Which means that this particular orbital infrastructure spans literally from the depth of the oceans all the way to the height of the skies, encompassing everything in between. So it's, while an object has all these different ecosystems somewhere being a part of its entire life, which is so wild to me. I do not know of anything else that has such a profound effect on so many layers of Earth and the atmosphere. What do you think about it? Just literally like the slice that it cuts through. And at this point, I'm going to reference this one beautiful drawing that you've made, and we'll put it somewhere on the website or something. But literally from the sea to the space.
It's really pretty wild, as you say it, Vaish, that these are two kind of, like, what I call these are these extreme environments. One which we're looking at is the graveyard orbit, which is this zone at the outermost reaches of orbital space, which is basically what humans look at, which is 22,000 miles above the surface of the Earth. And then we're looking at the space cemetery, which is like this remote, desolate site which is located in the depths of the South Pacific Ocean, where no human being has been. So it's kind of these kind of two extreme or limit conditions, or new frontiers of waste, as I call them. And it's like really interesting. Actually, I specifically chose to dwell on these two sites for a couple of reasons. First is that these two present remote, there is this author who's done fantastic work in this field, Steve Pine. He talks about he talks about extreme environments. They're remote, they're uninhabited, and they're unruly natural spaces. These nevertheless are very compelling sites of human practices and politics, because these are places where human politics do play out. But we are so disconnected, we are so remote, we are so far away from these unruly natural spaces that we do not know about them. The other interesting part about both of these kind of spaces is that they represent spaces where humans can go in a way, but you need life sustaining technologies to support you, and you can only go there temporarily, like with the case with outer space or in the depths of the South Pacific Ocean. So almost, it's like life doesn't exist in these two places. It's at a very microbial level where humans wouldn't necessarily inhabit it themselves. But it's like, their peripheral location and almost inaccessible character of these extreme environments makes their study so fundamental, because just because there is a lack of other humans or even a biota of, to resist this kind of, politics being played out there, has resulted, almost in a lack of urgency to examine these environments. There's a lack of urgency to examine their environmental histories. There's a lack of urgency in understanding that these are not working in isolation. They are having profound impacts on people on Earth, as well as different kind of species that are there. What is interesting, Vaishnavi, if I could just dwell on this a little further,
Sure.
is that with these satellites is this whole concept of geographical distancing and displacement. So what they do is essentially you distance this kind of operation so far away, so remote from our day-to-day activities that we don't even think about them ever occurring, and then you displace it completely out of context. Like, you would never think that a space station would be occupying the depths of an ocean. That's something that would never cross your mind. So you basically geographically distance something, and then you immediately displace it out of human consciousness in a lot of ways, like public consciousness in a lot of ways. And this basically, not only helps obscure their waste proceedings, which are highly radioactive and toxic for the environment as well as other species from public purview, you also drive into oblivion. You almost make it inconsequential, the contested nature of their environmental repercussions. So that for me has been very interesting, because in this race to kind of privatize outer space, you see this politics of visibility, which we as architects and spatial thinkers are so embedded in. We look at visibility with this whole concept of visibility and how it's been deployed to, for economic benefits and kind of evading environmental responsibility for the actions is very interesting for me. This is what I often keep referring to as the holy trifecta or the holy trinity, which is like kind of distancing. You distance something completely out of your lens. You make it so massive in scale that, it's so obvious these objects are massive. You're looking at space stations which are like massive, and then you make them invisible. So it's so paradoxical. Something which is so big, something which is so huge, is almost invisible.
None of us have studied advertising or marketing, but my father, pretty well versed with the marketing and advertising world, would always say that one of the biggest mottos of marketing is out of sight is out of mind. And when you in that light, when you see all these orbital infrastructures that are literally out of sight, they're out of mind, and that perhaps explains the reason why we don't have either proper legal frameworks or the kind of commitment from different nations towards really regulating that space that is so unregulated right now, which is a perfect segue to really talk about the afterlives of these orbital infrastructures and their decommissioning, because you, in pretty good length, actually frame these decommissioning processes as, kind of graveyards and cemeteries. And I also think of the whole process as something that deals with space waste, to be honest, for a layman who doesn't know anything about what happens to satellites after they die. This is not by any means comparable to the way we manage waste on Earth, but say if we were to start a program that would teach space waste management, what would that entail, and what are the various agencies that would need to form coalitions both internationally and internationally to regulate the outer space? What do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. Before I dwell further into like what is these afterlives, like it's important for us to like recognize that most satellites, when they're built with an expected lifespan of 5 to 10 years, post which they're rendered defunct.
So wait. So all of this energy and all of this capital and everything that goes on put together this one object is done with an expiry date that probably lasts as long as my phone and my laptop.
Probably. And that's what Lisa Parks, who is also a great lady who's doing work within this realm, says, that we live in an age in which extremely expensive machines are made and installed in orbit without public knowledge, using public funds, only to be spectacularly blown away and become total losses in front of our eyes. It's such a, like, when you think about it, it's such an interesting concept, because we think that satellites, oh, they're going to live on for hundreds and thousands of years. It's actually not true. That is one of the first kind of contradictory things that come up, with satellites. And what happens is that once the shelf life of now see, a satellite can be rendered defunct once its operational lifespan comes to an end. Even if like a tiny speck of paint is left in outer space, which is, really moving at exceptionally high speeds, which has happened to like, hit your satellite, it's going to be rendered defunct because it would make it unoperational in a lot of ways. So in addition to these kind of factors, what happens is that once now, like I mentioned earlier, it's gotten so overpopulated outer space that they need to kind of do like, housekeeping in a lot of ways. They clean up their mess. So what they do is, once the shelf life of a satellite is about to come to an end, it needs to be disposed of in such a way that it does not interfere with the global circulation routes, either in outer space and on Earth. So now what happened was, and there was this kind of space disposal convention which was led by NASA, which we all know is so like, like has been instrumental in shaping the space movement. What they said is, you either blast off these satellites into this zone which I had mentioned earlier, which is a graveyard orbit, which is 22,000 miles away from the surface of the Earth. So which is almost in this dark abyss in outer space. So you try to basically, design your satellite in such a way that it would start losing fuel towards the end, and it would just blast itself off into outer space. Now, this is increasingly becoming difficult because there's a very high risk of collision, because there are already existing satellites in that range, So, and as a result, it results in like this kind of ripple effect, wherein, the satellite keeps disintegrating into smaller parts, which would cause a very high kind of threat to the multi-billion-dollar infrastructure which is already in outer space. So what our great kind of, astro entrepreneurs and my dear friends Elon Musk, etc., have done is, they think that it's better we bring back all this junk from outer space and dump it on Earth. So what they do this, there has been this conscious shift, where they're disposing of all these dead space objects into this isolated oceanic graveyard, which is what is called the spacecraft cemetery, So then that is this point in the South Pacific Ocean, which is like called Point Nemo, where no man has ever been. But it's such a huge kind of, radius of dumping, like a dumping ground, like a dumping ocean ground wouldn't make the most sense here, but like a waterscape, where all of this is getting dumped. You would have all of this kind of debris, which is like there are 170 million untracked pieces of space waste currently orbiting at of 17,500 miles per hour. So you have to realize this is exceptionally high. So what they essentially do is this, like in the second operation where I'm saying that they bring back all this junk to Earth. Recently, actually, China had done an operation wherein they got their massive space station back to Earth. And they've been dumping all of these things in this large span, in the South Pacific Ocean. So, like, if I were to just give you like a geographical view of it, like it geographically spans around 3,000 kilometers by 5,000 kilometers. So it's a large expanse which you're seeing, and you're seeing this dumping happening not recently, but it's actually since 1971, So from 1971 to 2016, if you were to see, there were 190 Russian space objects which were dumped in the cemetery on Earth, including a SpaceX, rocket, which are these massive rockets that, Elon Musk really operationalizes. So this is kind of, this afterlives is something which is very fascinating for me, because you would never think what the hell would a discarded satellite do. And it's so funny, like one of these space scientists said that tackling the problem of space debris, like space waste, is one of humankind's greatest environmental challenges right now. He said that like these different kind of transitional zones, so you would deem certain zones as sacrifice zones, wherein there is no way it can ever jump back or be resilient enough. So this is actually exceedingly causing so many environmental challenges for people, because it nothing is working in isolation. Everything has an effect on something else, and all this constant kind of dumping has resulted in so many environmental challenges that space scientists are actually saying this is one of humankind's greatest challenges in the coming decades. And perhaps the one is least known to people.
So again, what do you think is needed to have people come together, both in terms of policies, legal framework, international efforts? Do you know of any efforts that are ongoing right now that do address this problem? Or if you were to kind of propose something, what would that framework look like? The space waste management program?
Vaish, like, to be really honest, like as interesting as this topic is, this topic has made me realize how inconsequential I am in this bigger political choreography of things that are happening. Like as a student, who is investigating this, as someone who's really like, fond of geographies of these things, I just realized I have almost zero agency over something like this, because these are made through very like vested political and economic interests. Like if you were to see the rate at which we are going and, dealing with our orbital space, there would be stringent laws to deal with it. But surprisingly, we're still using laws which were made during the space race with Russia and United States during the Cold War. So you can imagine, since then, it has been several decades now that we've not even considered revising these laws. These laws were not made for our present day. So there's almost defunct laws, which makes it a very good playing field for all these kind of private agencies. Because when you don't have any laws in place to hold you accountable for what mess you're creating, it's almost like, the devil's playground. You can do whatever you want, and the best is you can go scot-free. So obviously, like from my point of view, if there were to be any profound changes that had to be made, or something which is like, which had to be like in a way instrumental to bring about any kind of accountability in terms of both legal as well as political accountability, we need definitely a new set of space laws which are coming in. We need a new kind of revision of the laws of the open seas, like which is something which is where like you would see the concept where the space cemeteries are located, the laws of the open space and the open skies. These are kind of two realms where we definitely need more stringent policy frameworks in. For me, I really like, I do understand that, I don't have too much agency in that field, but as an artist too, just rendering these kind of spaces visible to the common public so that you can build up certain traction, is a sense of awareness among these kind of things, and also building up on political debate, like public debate about these issues, is something which I think would be a good kind of step towards understanding a domain which we all think is so far away and doesn't affect us, but it actually has really profound implications on our lives. So simply just being aware of it would also help, us kind of try to, keep pace with the kind of changes that are happening in orbital space right now. So for me, in terms of like what were an effective space management program, I would definitely think that, a lot more accountability by nation states, and more than nation states, I really feel there needs to be very, very stringent laws, which we're also seeing like with, you know, in the internet, and how Google and other companies are kind of, extracting all this, like using artificial intelligence, etc. We really need good kind of like, similar to these antitrust laws, we need like, these anti-exploitation laws in some ways to deal with outer space as well as the oceans, because these are the two most heavily unregulated spaces that we currently occupy in the world, in our universe, to be honest. So this strategic deregulation needs to be nipped in the bud in a lot of ways.
Well, Raji, if it is of any concession, I don't think you're an inconsequential actor at all. I, in fact, feel like maybe, maybe that agency that you're talking about, maybe well, first, I don't think agencies can be quantifiable, but let me just say, you put in a lot of time in your master's program, really just giving so much of honestly just critical and sensitive thought towards this thing that at least we as architects don't really think about. And so it makes you really aware about just one, design as a profession, and really kind of brings to light this entire scale that is so different and so kind of ginormous in scale, because it doesn't look at environment as in the environment we deal with it in terms of buildings, but as you say, right from the depth of the seas to the heights of the skies. And this is something that we don't think about enough. So I think it's a beginning, and who knows, maybe, I don't know, 5-10 years down the line, you choose to run for office, you're probably working as a consultant for NASA. I don't know. SpaceX, maybe you write policy for them, but hey, it's possible. I think what's important is that it's a beginning, and it's a project that I think has been given so much of thought and has just kind of so much curiosity from so many other people, that even if sequence of change has started, I think you just need to influence maybe one another person who's just as excited, and then it can go on. So it's been some time since you wrote the thesis. What have you been up to since then, and what do you plan on doing with this incredible piece of research? So what's next for Rajji Desai?
Oh my God, Vaishnavi, first, you're too kind, and I love that you believe in me so much, because I really don't believe in me so much. So this is really, really sweet, and it's very nice of you to say.
This is crazy, but yeah, go ahead.
But yeah, it's been a year since I graduated, and to be really honest, I really want to give credit to Neil Brenner. He has been like one of the most instrumental kind of people in my life in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to this topic, because he literally just let me loose with it. He's like, just let your wildest imaginations run wild, because there's no kind of like drawings or maps of outer space, so that kind of critical investigation, both theoretically via text, as well as since I've been also developing a lot of like maps, etc., which we're doing with outer space and illustrations, that was really good, because that for me was very profound. So I just wanted to give due thanks to Neil, and Abby Spinak, as well as Ed Eigen. These were really instrumental people in shaping my thesis in a lot of ways. And it's like I said, it's been a year. I've been working in Boston still. Quite surprisingly, I'm still stuck around in Cambridge. So I'm working as an urban researcher now, at CBT Architects, where there is Kishore Varanasi, with whose team I work with. He's terrific. He does a lot of, he's been embedded within the Boston fabric for really long, the urban planning and urban design realm. And it's really interesting, because now I've kind of switched from technological objects to building as objects, and in their processes of mitigating climate change. So that's been really interesting, because we've been doing like a lot of work in the Middle East, where we're looking at how cities can be better adapted to climate change and extreme heat, because this is something that is a very big concern for this people out there. What's next? I really don't know, but I hope it's something interesting that keeps my brain cells, excited in a lot of ways.
Well, I expect nothing less from you, Raji. Thank you so much for being here today and again for showing up. You have a fan in me forever, and your thesis shall live on in the racks of the GSD library for decades to come. So, thank you so much. This was a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Vaishnavi, for having me, really.
Special thanks to Kahan Shah for the background score. If you enjoyed listening to this episode, don't forget to subscribe to Architecture Off Center on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes are released every 2 weeks. You can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Arc of Center. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. Thanks for listening.